Welcome everyone. Welcome to our first MStranslate Facebook Live video for 2022. So as always, we're just going to give a few minutes to allow a few people to join, and then we'll get started on it. So I can see we've got a few people watching now. So if you are watching, please let me know, say hi, let me know who's here. Welcome to everyone. So as I said, we will get started shortly. Just let a few people get the notification that we've started the broadcast, and then I'll get started. So say hi, let me know if you are here. Let me make sure that I can see all of the comments that are coming through. And let me know where in the world you are watching from as well. Always good to have a bit of an idea who we've got joining us on the broadcast and where you're all tuning in from. Hi Patricia, hi Dee. No worries at all. Thank you for joining us. Get some water in. All right, so hi Mary, welcome. Thanks for joining from Canberra. So as I'm going to get started getting into what we're going to be talking about tonight, but as I do, please feel free to keep letting me know if you're watching. Make sure you give the post a bit of a like so that other people can find it as well, and say a comment. Let me know that you're here and watching. All of those little things help make sure that more people can get access to this. It makes more people realize that the broadcast is going live. So in tonight's Facebook Live, we're going to be talking about some of the latest research that has connected Epstein-Barr virus, or EBV, to multiple sclerosis. Now, we've published a couple of videos on this already, and so you've got a little bit of background, but I'm still going to go through all of that information again tonight and then answer any questions that you have. Hi Muna, joining us from Morocco. You're currently winning in terms of joining us from the furthest away at the moment, so thank you for joining. Is this your first time on an MStranslate live video? I'm not sure that I've seen you on here before. If so, welcome. Thank you for joining us. If not, welcome back. It's always great to have lots of people on here. I am just going to start just with a little comment around our video material to make sure that you get access to all of the videos that we do. One thing that I'd suggest is that you do go to our YouTube channel and subscribe. We're going to be doing a lot of video content this year. I'm going to make it a priority to try and do as many video updates as I can. We'll obviously keep going with all of our written articles as well, but we're going to be doing lots and lots of video content. And the best way to make sure that you see all of those videos is actually to subscribe to us on YouTube. We know that with Facebook, it can be a little bit hit and miss whether or not you see those videos unless you're going to our Facebook page every day directly. If so, that's fantastic. Please keep doing that. But if you do subscribe to our YouTube channel, you should then get notifications and see every time you go to YouTube, you'll see when there's a new video from us published. So I do recommend that if you haven't yet subscribed to our YouTube channel, please do that. It's just really, the best way, as we say, that you can find all of our content, and we will be doing a lot more video content this year. Hi Annette, joining us from Melbourne. You're sweltering through the heat along with me at the moment, Annette. It has been a very hot week here in Melbourne, and it just keeps going with no sign of a cool change yet. And hi Jody, welcome as well. Thank you to everyone that's joining us so far. Great to see so many of you being involved tonight. So let me start just by giving a little bit of an overview of where we're at with this research and a bit more of a recap, I guess, of what we've seen from these latest research findings. Welcome from Perth, Jody. So I guess if we start with as far back as we can go in terms of this story, we've known for a really long time that multiple sclerosis is caused by some combination of genetic and environmental factors. And we've had insights in terms of what these genetic and environmental factors may be. Some of the recent genetic studies have shown us upwards of 200 potential genetic variations that may increase the susceptibility to multiple sclerosis, and we've had a number of potential environmental factors be implicated, such as Epstein-Barr virus, which we're going to be talking about a lot tonight, but as well as other things like vitamin D, for example, which is hypothesized to be involved based on the latitude gradient that we see with multiple sclerosis, or to put that more simply, the fact that the further away from the equator you live, or actually you grow up, because there seems to be an age dependency to that, the more likely you are to develop multiple sclerosis. And so we've known that there's these combination of factors before. Now, if we think about the EBV story in particular, it's something that's been around for a while, but been quite difficult, I guess, to really understand exactly what its implication is in multiple sclerosis. So if I take you back to when I started in multiple sclerosis research, which is quite a while ago now, the EBV story was around then, and so this is 15 years ago when I was starting out in the lab. But at that time, what we really knew is that it seemed like people living with multiple sclerosis may have had slightly higher infection rates of EBV than the general population. But the numbers at that time, weren't really something that, to me anyway, suggested something hugely significant, because at the time it was probably about 94-95% of people living with multiple sclerosis had been infected with Epstein-Barr virus, but it was sort of 85-90% of the general population as well. So it was, while it was slightly higher, it was also really prevalent in everyone. And so it was hard to really think that maybe there was a huge link there. Now, what's happened more recently, and particularly over the past 2 years, there have been two really significant studies. There was a German study published in 2021, and then more recently, at the start of 2022, a study out of the US, a Harvard-based study looking at military veterans. And what both of these studies have shown is that it's actually 100% of people living with multiple sclerosis who have been previously infected with Epstein-Barr virus, or EBV. Now, the reason for the difference between these numbers being 100% and the numbers that I was suggesting 15 years ago is just that some of the techniques have become more sensitive. And so these new studies have used a couple of different techniques to be able to determine whether a person has been previously infected with Epstein-Barr virus. And so doing this in two quite large cohorts of people, so they were both around about 1,000 people living with multiple sclerosis, they found that almost every single one, and basically every single one of these individuals had been infected previously with EBV. So that's higher than in the general population, where now maybe we think it's about 90-92%, somewhere around there. Now, one of the questions that I think is important to clarify really early on with this is a lot of people say, well, why is it so high in terms of the number of people infected with EBV? Because people may have an understanding that Epstein-Barr virus is the virus that causes glandular fever. And so very few of us have experienced or developed glandular fever in our life. And so we hear a lot from people living with MS when they hear these sort of studies going, well, that doesn't make sense, I've never had glandular fever. But actually Epstein-Barr virus does infect many of us, but many of us are infected with it without ever showing symptoms. So we never develop glandular fever. And so that's why the numbers are so high, even without that many people having had any symptomatic experiences with it. Glandular fever, if you have experienced it, is quite unpleasant and got really high amounts of fatigue and can be quite debilitating for an extended period of time. But so I guess the question then becomes, even if it's in 100% of people living with multiple sclerosis, it's still in 90% roughly of the general population, and we know that MS doesn't affect 90% of the general population. So what does this tell us? And so really simply at the moment, and these are still, I guess, theoretical because we don't know exactly what's going on, the general sort of hypothesis out of this is that you cannot get multiple sclerosis without having been previously infected with Epstein-Barr virus. So it's necessary, but it's not sufficient. Having been infected with Epstein-Barr virus alone is not enough to cause multiple sclerosis. So that's why, even though it's really prevalent in the general population, many people are infected with EBV, they don't all develop multiple sclerosis. So what does that tell us? Well, it tells us that in some way EBV, if this is correct, EBV seems to be related to the development of multiple sclerosis because it is necessary. In none of these individuals did we see MS develop without having been infected with EBV. And I'll go through a couple of the slightly new findings from this American study that I think adds more weight to this argument in a minute. But it suggests that it's necessary but not sufficient, and so there must be some interaction of the Epstein-Barr virus with those other genetic and environmental factors that we talked about at the start of this video. It's likely that timing is also really important. So you could potentially have these different factors, but you actually have to have them all coming together at the right time or for MS to develop. And so that's a really important finding here. And I'm going to also go on later in this video to talk about why this might be important therapeutically for multiple sclerosis. But at the moment, I'm just going to pause for a second. We've sort of gone through the big first part of the video. So I'm just going to pause for a second and give some time for people to ask questions if they have questions. So as always, if you've joined before or if this is your first Facebook Live video, all you need to do is type your questions in the comment box below the video and I will make sure that I will respond to all of them as they're coming through. We've had a couple of new people join and say hi. So hi Belinda, hi from Geelong, and hi Anna from Melbourne, also sweltering through the heat wave with the rest of us. Hi Sandy, thank you for joining as well. Now what? So I assume your now what is in what's the implication of these findings, and so I will be talking about that shortly, so hold on to that. I just want to go through some other findings of this first, but I will talk about what the potential implications are for this for people living with MS shortly. So yeah, I'm just going to pause for a minute or two, or a minute or so, and see if anyone has any other questions about that first bit of it in terms of what Epstein-Barr virus is and whether it makes sense in terms of what I was talking about the necessary but not sufficient aspect. Any questions from anyone about this so far? Hi to everyone else that's watching, maybe is watching in the background at the moment. right. Well, if there's no questions at the moment, I'll keep going on and talking about some of the new stuff. Sorry, question come through. Jody, it's interesting because, as you know, my son and I have MS, yet just me and my daughter are the ones who have had glandular fever. Yeah, so I guess, Jody, that probably comes back a little bit to what I was saying before in terms of a lot of us have been infected with Epstein-Barr virus without necessarily developing glandular fever. One of the things that I'm really interested in seeing in terms of how this story develops, just to slightly go off track a bit, but to think about where this research might go next, I'm interested to see of the people living with multiple sclerosis, how many did develop glandular fever, and whether or not that's higher than in the general population. So we know that everyone's been infected with EBV, but are they also more likely to have experienced glandular fever? Are the rates of that higher in people living with MS? And then if you just look at people living with MS and assuming that all of them have been infected with EBV previously, split that into two groups. One group being people living with MS who were infected with EBV but didn't develop glandular fever, people living with MS infected with EBV who did develop glandular fever, and seeing whether or not that does have an impact on the multiple sclerosis progression, I guess. Do we see quicker progression in people who experienced glandular fever, or do they progress more slowly? Does it impact on how quickly potentially they go to develop secondary progressive, or relapse rate or anything like that? I think there's a lot of interesting questions that can now be pursued and looked into based on this finding. Hi Harry, thank you for joining. Didn't have glandular fever but did have chronic pharyngitis as a teenager. Yeah, it's interesting, I guess. There are some things around some of these studies. So there was one individual in this recent American study that appeared to be EBV negative, though there are some things that they think around that in terms of some false negatives with testing and stuff like that. They do believe that it's likely that they've just missed it in that individual. But I guess again with something like chronic pharyngitis, looking into that and seeing how that might affect it, assuming maybe still EBV positive, and is there a link there at all that could be teased out. But I think now that we have this initial finding that I think is really interesting and does tell us something, it now, as well as potentially opening the door for many therapeutic approaches, which again I'm going to talk about shortly, I think it does allow us to ask a lot of other questions. There are a lot of things that can stem off from this that may tell us things about how EBV is involved, and potentially how it interacts with other factors. So, this is all of these questions is sort of just my opinion, but I think there is a lot that we can look into in terms of that. Yeah, so I think looking at all these different things, and there is a study, and we did an interview with Dr. Kelsi Smith from the Karolinska Institute after MS Virtual 2020, where she looked at infections during adolescence. And I wonder now with this sort of information whether they'll be able to use the data that they have and tease into it a bit further, because they saw some really interesting things in that initial study, but potentially again there's now more questions that they can look into. So yeah, a lot that we can do. GP has dosed her up with vitamin D as it's low. So vitamin D, I guess another potential environmental factor involved in multiple sclerosis, though we still need to learn more about that. Again, looking into, just to give an example of the sorts of questions that we can look into now based on all of this, is there a link between low vitamin D, Epstein-Barr, and glandular fever, and then developing MS. Does that, speed up in terms of the time frame between being infected with EBV and then the onset of MS? We know that, for example, again, we interviewed Professor Helen Tremlett from the University of British Columbia, again after MS Virtual 2020, and she was talking about the MS Prodrome, so this idea that there's a whole heap of medical events happening before a person is diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. Again, if we can, and a lot of this is difficult, I guess one thing that we should talk about in terms of why this US study is particularly interesting and why there is a lot of work that comes out of US military veterans is the useful part about having them as participants in these sort of studies is that they have a lot of samples across their lives. So they had a lot of blood samples from these people from before they were diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. And that's obviously one of the difficult things with this research generally is that, you're always looking after the fact. We're starting to look into multiple sclerosis in most people after they've been diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. So, if you could get some samples from people and work out when they were infected with EBV, so when they went from EBV negative to EBV positive, and then look at the time frame between that and the development of multiple sclerosis and see what factors may have been present or absent there, in terms of determining whether or not that was a really quick process or a long process. Low vitamin D, for example, as being one. I think you could get some really interesting answers again. But now I'm just going into, this is where the research side of my brain kicks in, and I start to just ask questions around things that I'd be interested in trying to look into around this. So let me catch up on some of my questions here. So Eric's dropped the link to the interview there with Kelsi Smith looking at infections during adolescence. So definitely have a look at that one if you haven't seen it before. We might try and drop the Prodrome interview in there as well to look at as well. So just following the appearance, this is from Muna, following the appearance of the results of the study concerning the incrimination of the Epstein-Barr virus, I did the serology and I found high levels, but my physician explained to me that there is nothing special to do. It's an old EBV infection. So yeah, I'm going to get into potentially what could be important in terms of the EBV infection in terms of therapy, but yeah, generally at the moment our sort of thoughts with all of this is just that there has to be an EBV infection prior to the development of multiple sclerosis. If these results are right and prove to be replicated, the likelihood here is that it is critical for the development of multiple sclerosis that the individual has been infected with Epstein-Barr virus. So we can talk about in the future as well how we may be able to use that knowledge to prevent multiple sclerosis from being developed, but there is also potentially a way of being able to use it to treat. Now, the important thing around an Epstein-Barr virus infection, which is different to some other infections, is that generally it's not completely cleared by the immune system. So while with a lot of other infections, you become infected, the immune system responds, you might get a little bit sick, but the immune system responds and then you clear that virus or you clear that bacteria. We know with Epstein-Barr virus that it tends to not be completely cleared, and it goes almost into what could be thought of as a hibernation state. So while a lot of it's cleared, some of it stays as a chronic infection, generally involved with things like B cells and around the central nervous system. So obviously there's some links there to multiple sclerosis, and may indicate why B cell therapies are effective, such as Ocrevus. But it's not completely cleared, and that's something that will become important when we start to talk about potential therapies for multiple sclerosis based on this EBV thing. So again, there's a bunch more information there. I'm just going to take a pause for a minute. I'm going to have a drink. If you've got any more questions on anything else, I'll just give a minute for those to come through before I talk about a little bit more about that US study. and a welcome to everyone watching. If you've just joined, thank you for joining. Feel free to say hello in the comments, as will all our videos. If you have any questions at any point, please do just drop them in the comment section, and I will be happy to respond. All right, so let me continue on. So I think one of the interesting stories, so as I said, we had that Harry, can you tell me or post a link maybe to the Stanford study that you're referring to? Not sure. So the Harvard study is the EBV study that I'm looking at, but let me know which Stanford study you're referring to. Is it EBV related? If you can just give me a little bit more information, I can comment on that. But so in terms of this Harvard study, looking at the US military veterans, one of the things that I think was particularly interesting, as I said, is that they had a number of blood samples from individuals from people before they were diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. And so what they did in those individuals is that they also looked at a marker called neurofilament light. Now, I mentioned this in one of the EBV videos that I've done and that I've sort of published already, but to give you an idea of what neurofilament light is, if you haven't heard of it before, it's essentially a marker of damage to nerves. So when there is nerve damage, like we would expect with multiple sclerosis, neurofilament light is something that just gets released into the bloodstream based on the damage to the nerves that's occurring. So there has been a research for a number of years now looking at whether or not this can be used as a biomarker for multiple sclerosis. So it could be, there's interest in whether or not it could be used as part of clinical trials. So looking at seeing whether or not a treatment is effective by seeing if there's a decrease in the amount of neurofilament light present in the blood, or just being able to routinely test an individual to see whether or not treatments are working, or things like that. So obviously being able to measure something in a simple blood test is pretty preferable to going in and having an MRI or something like that. So it was used in this study. It's not yet at the point where it's being used routinely in the clinic, but it was used in this study to see whether or not they could tie up or link the Epstein-Barr virus infection with damage to the nerves. And so there was a few individuals in particular where in their initial blood sample they were EBV negative. So these people hadn't yet developed multiple sclerosis, and they also hadn't been infected with Epstein-Barr virus. Interestingly, in those blood samples where they were EBV negative, they also found that there was no neurofilament light, so there was no indication of any damage to the nerves. Then, I guess over time, they had subsequent blood samples, and they could find the blood sample, the first blood sample, where they became EBV positive. So they'd been infected with Epstein-Barr virus at some point. And they also found that it was only after that blood sample that then they could detect the presence of neurofilament light as well. So that showed that there wasn't any damage to the nerves occurring until after the Epstein-Barr virus infection. So I think that's a really compelling new piece of evidence that really ties how EBV, if this study is right, showing that 100% of people living with multiple sclerosis are infected with EBV, and so it's critical for the development of multiple sclerosis. I think this evidence that also shows that there's no damage to the nerves until after the EBV infection is detectable. I think that's a really nice extra piece of information that helps this story. So yeah, I think that's one of the big advances that we've seen in this US study as opposed to some of the other ones. All right, just give me 2 seconds to look at this study. I think I've seen this briefly. I haven't looked yet at the publication, but I can talk about the the general principle behind it. So I will do a summary on the paper, this Stanford paper that's come out, but I can talk about the sort of principle behind it, because I think it's an interesting principle in terms of how EBV may be involved. So one of the ways that I guess we've thought for a while about how these viruses might be involved is through a process called molecular mimicry. So what is molecular mimicry? It's basically this idea that there is part of a virus or a bacteria, some foreign organism, that looks very similar to part of us. Now, that's a very simplified way of thinking about this in terms of looks similar, but I'll explain that a little bit further. How the immune system reacts is that we have specialized immune cells called T cells and B cells, and you've probably heard of these in relation to multiple sclerosis and multiple sclerosis treatments. But T cells and B cells both really specifically recognize small parts called peptides of foreign organisms. So, for example, if we think in a sort of current example, what we're doing with the coronavirus vaccines is that we're triggering an immune response to a small part of the spike protein of that virus. And so what we're thinking about in this instance is that there's a small part, if we think about how molecular mimicry might be involved in multiple sclerosis, or how molecular mimicry is involved in autoimmune diseases, is that there might be a small part of Epstein-Barr virus, so one of these peptides that looks very similar to a peptide that, say, comes from the myelin sheath. So initially, the immune system gets triggered to react against the virus. So it's doing exactly what it should do. The virus comes in, the immune system goes, this isn't meant to be here. It starts to get activated and it starts to respond against that virus. However, those cells that can recognize that small part of the virus can also cross-react. Basically, they can also recognize part of the myelin sheath, and so they then start to attack that, thinking that that's the virus that they're meant to be attacking. And so that's then how we get the development of the autoimmune response. So they are activated against something foreign, and then they recognize part of ourselves as foreign. And there are all mechanisms in place that are meant to stop this happening. That's called immune tolerance. We are meant to, during development, delete any immune cells that react against self. However, if they're actually designed to react against something foreign, like EBV, that may be a way that they can slip through, and then they react against EBV, but then somehow also react against ourself. And so that's what this Stanford study is looking into, how EBV might trigger multiple sclerosis by looking at that sort of concept of molecular mimicry. But I'll do a detailed summary of that study. Thank you for sharing it, Harry. I have seen some of the general stories. I just haven't had a chance yet to go through the actual publication to do that summary on it, but I will do it. Hopefully that made a little bit of sense. All right, Muna, I really need to know if the last study on EBV and multiple sclerosis specified a new treatment or a new management for people living with MS. Okay, great question. Let's get to that. I've been saying I'm going to talk about that since the start of the video, so let's talk about that now. If you have any comments or questions about anything else that I've talked about in the video, feel free to ask, but let's go on to talk about that. So I've done a video on this talking about, the initial video was talking about, is EBV a cause of multiple sclerosis? And I think being really careful around not saying it's the cause, because it's not the cause of multiple sclerosis. There has to be a lot of other factors that are contributing. Just being infected with EBV doesn't cause MS. If you get glandular fever, that doesn't mean that you will end up developing multiple sclerosis, for example. And we need to be really careful around that messaging so that we're not unnecessarily worrying a lot of people or generating false hope, because people think that this is the sole thing, and if we can just deal with that, then we've cured multiple sclerosis. But let's think about how this could potentially be used as a treatment target for multiple sclerosis. And as I said, I've done a second video that then just focuses on that. But so there are two ways, and let's focus to start with, because it's probably going to be of more interest to people watching this video, as to how it may be important for people who are already diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. So as I said, the important thing around this EBV infection is that it's chronic. Okay, so you've never completely cleared that viral infection. And so there is a school of thought that suggests that if that viral infection could be completely cleared, that would benefit people living with multiple sclerosis. And so one of the big proponents of that theory has been Professor Michael Pender from here in Australia. And so he's been looking into this for a long time. And I guess this story really developed sort of 6 or 7 years ago, I think it was. It might have been around 2014, when he published a case study. And it really was just a case study because it was a single individual. And so he tried something in this one person who was living with secondary progressive multiple sclerosis, where he removed some of their T cells. And so the T cells are cells in the immune system that are particularly important for clearing viral infections. So he removed some of their T cells, took them into the lab, and basically in the lab he souped them up. He exposed them to EBV and made them really active at responding to Epstein-Barr virus. He then re-injected those now hyperactivated T cells back into that individual living with secondary progressive multiple sclerosis. And basically what they saw is that it seemed to be now able to completely clear the virus. Having given them that extra boost, they were then able to clear the virus. And in terms of what that did for the individual, they found that, you know, there was some reduced fatigue and improved mobility. So it seemed to be that clearing the virus through that technique in that individual led to some clinical benefits. Now, as if you've followed MStranslate for a while, you will know that a study involving one individual is not really anything that we could derive any sort of conclusions from. But it was promising. And so Professor Pender has now gone on to do some further studies on that, and they published a study with 10 individuals. So again, it's still a relatively small study, but slightly larger. And they saw similar results, and they've actually been able to track those individuals out to 3 years, and they saw that some of those benefits that they saw, again, decreased fatigue was an important one. Some other clinical benefits, they saw that those did last out to 2 or 3 years in these individuals. They are now in the process of conducting a larger study through different sites across the east coast of Australia, but I believe they're still currently recruiting, or they haven't yet published any results of that yet. That trial is actually being done slightly differently to the earlier ones, in that they are no longer using an individual's own T cells. So they're not taking out the person's T cells, taking them into the lab, culturing them up, and then injecting them back. There was a bit of a realization that one was going to be quite a slow process, but also two may have some difficulties because you're taking out T cells from a person that's living with an autoimmune disease, and so there may be some difficulties there in terms of how well those immune cells are functioning. So instead what they're doing now is that they're using T cells from healthy donors. So they're taking those T cells from healthy donors, still doing that culturing to get them activated against EBV, and then injecting those into the people living with MS to see what's going on. And that is a very similar approach to a different group in the US called Atara Biotherapeutics, and they're also in the process of conducting some early stage trials using I think what they're calling their hyperactivated T cells is ATA-188. Off the top of my head, I think that's the compound, or what they're calling their specialized T cells. Again, they're T cells that have come from healthy donors, not individuals, and you can find some stuff online where they talk about their reasons for doing that. But so the whole notion here, and this is very early, okay, we're in very early stage trials of this. It seems to be safe based on the very early trials have been done, but we're still in phase 2 trials. We've still got a long way to go before this is potentially available for people living with MS, and we don't know if it will work on a large scale, and if it does work, what sort of benefits we'll see and how long they will last. But the idea here is that there is some evidence that suggests that if we can completely clear that EBV infection in people living with multiple sclerosis through that technique that I've just described, it may work as a therapeutic for people living with MS. It may be able to provide some benefits. Now, I don't think we're anywhere close to suggesting that that would be a cure. I don't think it's a cure, but it could be a new treatment approach. So in terms of the question around how could this be beneficial to people living with MS, that's really how it is. So that sort of idea, I guess, also gives us another piece of information. Originally, we were saying that an infection with Epstein-Barr virus is critical for the development of MS, but there is some indication from these results, these trials, that it may also be important in the progression of MS. So it may not just be that initial event, it may, because of the chronic nature of that infection, have some ongoing impacts on the progression of the disease. So hopefully that answers that question. Harry, yeah, thank you very much for sharing. So I think the Stanford study gives us an indication of, if these previous studies have said it's important and you can't have MS develop without an EBV infection, this Stanford study suggests why that might be the case. So potentially it is the trigger. Now, there's still going to obviously have to be other factors at play, because if that molecular mimicry that I talked about is the reason, that is the trigger, and again, I need to look exactly at their data to see what they've shown there. That's going to be the same in people who get infected with EBV and don't develop MS. So there's going to be some genetic component and potentially other environmental components that are still going to have to be important, even if that helps us understand a little bit more about how that EBV link is involved. So yeah, fantastic. So hopefully that answers the question around how this information may potentially benefit people living with MS in terms of a new treatment approach. The other thing that we can talk a little bit about is, I guess, in terms of how it might be used as a preventative moving forward. So understanding that if this research turns out to be correct and our current hypothesis is true, in that you can't develop multiple sclerosis unless you've had that EBV infection as the trigger, if we could have a vaccine for Epstein-Barr virus, then potentially we could prevent MS from developing. Now, there are lots of questions around this in terms of, how long would the vaccine be effective? Would there need to be boosters? All of that sort of stuff. We are nowhere near understanding any of that yet. There is a vaccine for Epstein-Barr virus that is currently being trialled. So this has been developed by Moderna. I believe it's an mRNA vaccine. So following on from the success of using that sort of technology and approach for the coronavirus vaccines, I believe they've just dosed their first individual with it. So we could not be at an earlier stage of this yet, but potentially, that could be something in the future, that if we did have a vaccine for Epstein-Barr virus that could stop people getting infected at all, potentially we could see that then as a way of preventing multiple sclerosis from developing. We're a long way away from that, but it's something that's interesting to think about at this stage. And I guess, as we've seen over the past 2 years, if we look at a silver lining of the COVID-19 pandemic, it's that if scientists and researchers are given the resources and funding that they need to conduct their work, then we can actually get developments and progress really quickly. So important to realize that it's a very early stage, but we may be able to see development quicker than we have previously because of some of the efforts that have been put into that area during the COVID-19 pandemic. Hey Castle, thank you for joining us. never had the virus. So it can be difficult to know if you've had the virus because most people are infected with EBV without ever having any symptoms. So yeah, you need to have some specialized blood tests that look and see whether or not there has been a previous infected, because most people are infected and never know it. They never develop glandular fever, they never have any symptoms. They're infected, hangs around, but you know, it's not something that's they're ever aware of because there aren't any symptoms. All right, so are there any questions around the treatment side of it? So we've sort of talked about the main findings here. We've talked about some of the new information that's come out of that US study in terms of, I guess, the timing on what's adding some extra evidence to this story that EBV might be critical for the development of multiple sclerosis. We've talked about potentially how it's triggering that through this notion of molecular mimicry, and then we've talked about how it's potential, or the potential for it to be used as a therapeutic. So any questions on any of this? Kylie, would our neurologist do that blood test to test for EBV when first diagnosed? It's a good question, but probably not. Though I don't know 100% the answer to that, and it's probably something that's different for different people. It's probably not the key thing at that time. It may start to become something that's used more often. I guess if this MS story is true, then I guess you could do a really quick test to see if a person has been infected with EBV to potentially rule out multiple sclerosis. That's how I could see it being used, because if you came back EBV negative, then any other symptoms that you're experiencing, again, if this all turns out to be true, it would be less likely that would be multiple sclerosis. At the moment, in terms of what these results suggest, we would think that a person who is EBV negative probably doesn't have multiple sclerosis. But there are some issues, as I said, there are some little things where occasionally a person can test negative even if it's positive, and some things like that. But I will ask some people about that and get back to you in terms of whether they routinely test, but it's probably not. As far as I'm aware, it's not something done, but actually people in our community are probably better placed to answer that than I am, because a lot of people here will have been diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. You can tell me during that time frame, did you have a blood test and were you told whether or not you were EBV negative or positive? Max, sorry I came in late. If EBV can be cured, could that mean a cure for MS? Yeah, so it's a good question. I personally am really reticent ever to use the word cure, especially at this point. I think we're too early to really know any of that. So I think if we take this a couple of steps to try and answer that question, Max, at the moment we have some evidence that suggests that Epstein-Barr virus, infection with Epstein-Barr virus, is critical for the development of multiple sclerosis. That you can't get multiple sclerosis unless you've been infected with EBV at some stage in your life. Now, we know that that's not everything, because we know that there are 90% of the population worldwide have been infected with EBV at some stage in their lives, and they do not develop, the majority of those people do not develop multiple sclerosis. We have 6 or 7 billion people in the world. We have about 2.5 to 3 million people living with multiple sclerosis. So it's necessary, but it's not sufficient. But if it's necessary, then potentially if we had a vaccine for Epstein-Barr virus where we could give that to children to stop them becoming infected with EBV, then potentially if you can stop that infection, could that mean that we would see that multiple sclerosis wouldn't develop? If we follow that story through it kind of makes logical sense, but we don't have any data to, this is all just hypothetical at this stage. There is possible that it can be treated, that EBV can be targeted as a possible other therapeutic approach. So where you look to clear that chronic infection, and that could have therapeutic benefits for people living with multiple sclerosis. Again, at that stage, once MS is developed, I don't think I would necessarily consider clearing that EBV infection as being a cure, but it could certainly have therapeutic benefits, because at that stage there's probably lots of other things that are going on. It could help, but I don't think we have any evidence to suggest that a person would be cured. We've seen from some really small trials at this stage improvements in fatigue, some improvements in mobility, but certainly not a cure. We certainly haven't seen anything to suggest that the MS has disappeared. In fact, that's not what we've seen at all. So yeah, hopefully that answers your question, Max. Neuro suggested I start, Neuro suggested I start on different Gilenia tabs. Any thoughts? That's not really a question I can answer. That's a discussion to have with your neurologist. As I sort of say in all of these, my background is purely MS research. It's not clinical, so I can't give any sort of clinical comments at all. Sorry, I know that's probably not the answer that you're looking for there, but yeah, sorry, just not something I can answer. Wondering why I haven't seen Eric and I for a while. Sorry, it has been quite a while since we've done a Facebook Live broadcast. Obviously the end of the year is a really busy time, so I can't actually remember when I did the last one in 2021. I almost said 2020. The last one in 2021. So yes, I can't remember if I did one in December or not, but apologies that it's been a while since we did one of these. We will look to do them regularly this year. We will look to have guests come on and talk to you as well, so that it's not just me the whole time. We will look to do that and look to do them pretty regularly. And as I said at the start, we will be doing a lot of video content this year. So if you haven't already, do subscribe to our YouTube channel. That is the best way that you can make sure that you stay up to date with all of the videos that we publish. All right. So I think that covers a lot of the EBV story. Said the whole point of tonight's broadcast was really to come on and sort of summarize all of the research again, but answer some more questions around it, understanding that there have been a lot of questions already posted across our YouTube channel and our Facebook page, which hopefully we've responded to all of them. If we haven't responded to a question that you've posted and you're either online now, feel free to ask it now, or if you see this at a later date, just prod us with another comment under this video and I'll make sure I go back. Sometimes we do just miss them. It's definitely not that we're ignoring any question. It's just sometimes the notification doesn't come up, or it just gets lost in some of the other ones that we're doing. So I promise you that we are doing our best to always respond to every comment and question that comes up. So if you have asked one and haven't got a response, I do apologize for that, and we will respond as quickly as can. So Cassell, to connect to the YouTube channel, you just need to go to the website of our YouTube channel, and I'll see if Eric can drop the link to our channel page there. You just click on that link. That'll take you to sort of the homepage of our channel on YouTube, and then there should be a button there that just says subscribe. Just click that link. You will need to be signed into your YouTube account, or if you haven't created a YouTube account, you'll need to sign in and make one. That's a really quick and easy process to do. And then just click subscribe, and then I think you will get email notifications to let you know when a new video has been posted by a channel that you follow, such as ours, or anytime you go to YouTube, on your homepage there, you will see our new videos pop up because you're a subscriber to them. It's just a much more effective way of making sure you see our content. We will post them to Facebook, but we know that not necessarily everyone who follows us on Facebook sees all of our content like that. So it's just another good way of doing it to make sure you see all of that sort of material. So Oh, so am I, Cassell. So am I. There's a lot of self-training that goes on for all of this sort of stuff. But we'll try, and if we can't get that up, let me see if I can just. I'm going to try and post. Oh, there we go. Eric's just posted that up now. So that will take you through to our channel page, and then on that page you can click subscribe. Now I don't know if that's just disappeared. That's disappeared for me. I don't know if that's disappeared for everyone else. Potentially we can't post that link. So yes, but anyway, if there's no further questions, we might wrap this up. Seeing as everyone's been listening to me for about an hour already. So any last questions on anything that we've talked about tonight? We'll continue to provide updates on this. We might look to do a couple of interviews with some of the researchers who are involved in these trials. But as always, you can continue to ask questions under this video if you're watching it at a later date. So, doesn't seem like there's too many more questions coming through. Hopefully that means that it's all made sense. So as always, thank you very much for watching the broadcast. Thank you for all of the people who have participated in the broadcast, either just by watching it or by submitting questions. Sarah, I've just joined now. Sorry, should I be tested for EBV? It's certainly a discussion that you can have with your neurologist. So you will be able to go back and watch this whole video. It gets published to our Facebook page as soon as we finish, so you'll be able to go back and watch it all. Basically, at the moment, we're just suggesting, this new research suggests that being infected with EBV is a necessary part of the development of multiple sclerosis. If you've already been diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, really what the interesting part of this is some stuff that's in very early stage trials at the moment to see whether or not targeting EBV may be a potential treatment approach. But that's still a while away from being a reality. We're in very early stage trials for that at the moment. So maybe not a huge benefit to being tested at this point. If you're interested in it based on this research that's out, certainly talk to your neurologist about it. It should be relatively easy to do, and they may have some information on that already. So, as always, you can talk to your neurologist about it, and if you have any questions or you want to think about questions to ask them, or they tell you something and you want to ask about the research side of it, you can always drop us a message and we can help with that. Simone's just started viewing. Will there be a replay? Yeah, so as soon as I mean, you can go back to the start of it now. You can stop listening to what I'm saying live and go back to the start. But as soon as we end the live video, it gets published to our Facebook page, so you can watch the video whenever you want. I've been talking for about an hour, so much easier to watch the replay, and then you can just watch it in bits and pieces. You can continue to comment under that video, so any questions that get posted after I finish broadcasting, I will still make sure that I respond to all of those. So yes, you will be able to watch the full video whenever you want and continue to ask questions. Just going back to the question from Muna. If only this new study on the involvement of the Epstein-Barr virus in triggering multiple sclerosis could be a beacon of hope in the eradication of multiple sclerosis or its definitive treatment, instead of spending a whole life taking drugs that only have an effect on the symptoms. Yeah, so I think, it's a great comment, and I'm sure a lot of people watching the broadcast would relate to that feeling as well. What I would say around what I think is a positive around the potential use of targeting this as a treatment is that what separates this approach to current approaches is that it's actually targeting something that appears to be causing part of the problems. So I guess that's different in terms of the other approaches where we're targeting the immune system. Now we know that the immune system is causing problems, but it's not, it's doing its job in a way. It's not doing its job correctly, but it's not the initial problem. Here it appears like EBV may be part of an initial problem that's causing some of the worsening of disease. So I think being able to target that may provide some clinical benefits with less side effects than we see necessarily with other treatment approaches. Now, it's not to say that this would be a sole treatment approach. I think, once a person is living with multiple sclerosis, there may be a number of different things going on. So, this in combination with other therapies, in combination with potentially remyelination and myelin repair therapies, who knows what the best approach will be. But, I think that being able to target the problem directly is a nice new approach, potential approach. We've got to see if it's effective yet, but I do understand what you're saying. All right. So with that, again, I will start to wrap up unless a couple of any questions come in at the end. Thank you to everyone who has watched and participated. As I said before, we will be doing lots more of these. Thank you for your ongoing support of everything that we're doing at MStranslate. It is much appreciated. We have seen such fantastic engagement on all of our posts recently, so we really do appreciate that. The best way to support what we're doing at the moment is just to continue to be active across our platforms. Like, comment and share posts. That helps us a lot. It helps us be able to convince researchers that they should work with MStranslate and post across our platform, so you get to hear directly from the people doing the work. They're going to be more likely to do that if they know they're talking to an engaged audience. So the more of that you do, the better it is for us. But you have been doing such an amazing job of that, as always. So from the entire MStranslate team, thank you for that. I'm sure I will be back soon with research summary videos and more Facebook Live broadcasts. Until that time, while we continue to navigate the coronavirus pandemic as well as lots of other issues around the globe, please do continue to stay safe, look after yourselves and look after each other, and know that MStranslate, as always, is a safe place to come. If you are struggling at all, drop a line, and I'm sure you will have members of our community reaching out with open arms to give you a hug and to support you through those times. So thank you. I look forward to talking to you again soon. Good night for now.